Welcome everyone to the Board Game Bunker podcast. My name is Ryan, and I'm here with Nate.
Hello.
Nate, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Even though you're a co-owner in this.
right. Co-host.
Yes, co-host. All the things. Co-board gamer. Me and Nate are starting a board game podcast. This is our very first episode. The purpose of this podcast is to bridge the gap, so to speak, between the Eurogamers and the campaign gamers and the Wargamers, because honestly, not a lot of Eurogamers know about Wargames, and most of the Wargamers kind of snoff at Eurogames.
Yep.
So Nate is the resident Wargamer, I'm the resident Eurogamer, and we do enjoy games from the other genres as well, but we really want to bridge the gap and make this kind of a community-building endeavor for both kind of communities, so to speak.
Right, exactly.
So today's podcast is really just going to be an introduction to our kind of podcast as a whole, what we are hoping to do, even though you just heard a little bit of it, and who we are as board gamers, who we want to be as board gamers, what our hopes and dreams for this channel are. If you're catching this on YouTube, hi everyone. If you're catching this on podcast, you can listen and watch on YouTube as well, or vice versa. So however you most want to enjoy this, feel free. And drop a comment, as always, to let us know. As always, who am I saying? This is our first episode. Drop a comment to let us know what sort of board games you want us to cover down the road. And if we can get it, we'll try to.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, Nate, so tell us a little bit about yourself and your board game history and your loves and joys for all that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, my background in board games in particular is I love history myself. I'm a history person. I was a history teacher for several years, and then when I came to do graduate work, while I was doing my master's degree, I was over at a professor's house for the department had a Christmas party over at a professor's house, and unbeknownst to me, the professor then asked a bunch of us in the room if we would like to come see his board game room. And sure, yeah, I'll come, sure.
Yeah,
and board games had always been interesting to me. I'd played a few and played something like Axis and Allies or Risk or something like that. But I didn't know what I was walking into going into his board game room. Walk in and it's this giant room, massive table right in the middle. And then he starts pulling out all kinds of different historically themed games, particularly war games.
Nice.
And I was just staring at these things going, I cannot believe that these exist. Apparently they've been around for decades, and I had no clue they were around. And no sooner than I went home, I started looking at every single website I could about war games.
Nice.
And I tried to figure out what would be the first war game that I was going to buy. And then ended up buying one and loving it and jumped headlong into the hobby. And now I obviously started with one game. Now I have close to 70 games. And it's been about
not many years, right?
Since about 2018, Christmas of 2018.
Okay.
So not long.
So about 4 years you've accumulated about 60, 70 war games.
Yep.
So what rate is that per month?
I don't know.
I think we're talking probably close to 2 a month.
Well, when all the war game companies have massive Christmas sales, and it's kind of hard not to resist them.
Right.
Especially ones that you know that you've been wanting for a while, and I'll just wait until I can get them all at once.
So my understanding, based on what you've told me, is that a lot of times the war games, that you can't always just buy them all the time like you can find most Euros. Sometimes you have to wait for them to reprint, right?
Correct, yes. Yeah, a lot of them, unfortunately, if you don't get them on the pre-order when they first come out, many times you'll have to wait.
Yeah.
And probably wait a good 2, maybe even 3 years to get the second printing.
Yeah.
Depending on even if the first edition actually does well.
Sure, so you may not get another option at all down the road if you
don't
get the first time around.
Correct. You'll have to find it on the secondary market. And sometimes, depending on the game, you could be spending upwards of maybe $100, $150.
Yeah.
And there are a few games that go for well over, say, $300, $400.
Yikes.
I have yet to make those kind of purchases. But I've spent over $100 on a game before.
Yeah.
And thankfully, I've never been disappointed in spending that money.
Right.
But, I mean, nowadays, I'm working on my PhD in history.
Yeah.
And I seem to always have in my office, in my house, on my table, a game out.
Well, I think at all times. The podcast, the more the YouTube side of the podcast, we'll have to do a video there so that everyone can see your
oh, sure.
It's a glorious table, guys. I've seen it. I've beat Nate on this table myself.
He has, unfortunately, yes. Unfortunately.
Now on the flip side of the cost, though, there is a board game you're getting soon, I believe, that costs you almost nothing because you happen to snag it just at the right time, right?
Correct. Yes. Somehow through the I don't know the wonders of the way that life works, the game that I am super excited about getting is the board game readaptation of the PC game Europa Universalis.
Fantastic.
I mean, it originally came out sometime in the mid-90s, early to mid-90s, as a board game, and it became very popular.
Right.
And popular enough where the video game company Paradox Interactive decided to license the game. And that spawned this massive series of games that they have had over the years. And Europa Universalis is at sort of the cornerstone of their video game market. And they're on number 4 now. And they get thousands and thousands of concurrent players. So sometime I think it was like about 2017, a company decided that they wanted to try to adapt the game back into a board game.
Nice.
And had been fiddling with it and working on it. They put a full model of it on Tabletop Simulator for people to play test, and I haven't been able to play test it myself at all, but I've just been staring at it and watching it, watch videos of people playing it. It looks awesome. And then lo and behold, they are about ready to ship it out to Kickstarters and pre-orders, and they said this is your last chance to get it.
Yeah.
And I was like, it's about $200 for the whole deluxe edition with all the stretch goals from Kickstarter. I thought, should I do this? Should I not? And yeah, I did it.
Yeah.
And it was like $200 and I think it was like $28, something like that. And then lo and behold, all of a sudden, where I live, I got a state reimbursement check for $200. So, and then I had like another check for like $20. So it ended up being that the game cost me $8.
For money you weren't expecting ultimately.
Not expecting at all. No, not expecting. So hopefully it'll come soon.
I hope so, because I think he's in Atlanta right now, you said?
Something like that. I think it's in Jacksonville, Florida, in a warehouse.
Now, tell our audience, if you will, a little bit about like what the game is for someone who doesn't know about Europa Universalis.
Sure. I mean, Europa Universalis is sort of a 4X grand strategy game set during the end of what's called the medieval period in Europe, 1444, at the beginning of sort of the Renaissance period, as Europe begins to expand beyond the continent and begin to explore the world.
Right.
And it goes from 1444 all the way to around 1820.
Okay.
And more or less, you can pick nearly any country in Europe. The game allows you to also play not only with, I think it's up to 6 players, but also solitaire as well.
Oh, fantastic.
With bots for all of the different countries that you play with. And a lot of it's not just a military game. There's a lot of diplomacy and politics involved as well, and a lot of economic, like trying to steer trade towards your own country so you can make a lot of money.
So it's bring a little bit of the Euro aspect into it, it sounds
Correct.
like.
Yes. Yeah. It's more of like a 4X game as opposed to just a straight war game.
Right. Right.
But it looks awesome.
Which that's the one thing I've noticed in the gaming community overall is that you've had the war games for years in the 70s and 80s, and then the Ameritrash stuff, your Monopoly and Sorry, and then your Euro starting with Catan in '95. But so much of it nowadays is a conglomeration of all of it.
Yeah.
You think of even a game like Gloomhaven, it's got some economic stuff to it, or something like one of my favorite games we'll talk about is Root, and it looks like a Euro game, but it's more of a war game in a way. It's just disguised in kind of Euro packaging and Euro types of pieces.
Yep.
So really the best of both worlds a lot of times is when you start choosing, okay, this mechanic works really well from this game, this mechanic works well from this game. Let's see how we can package it together with a really cool theme and see how it works.
Yeah.
And that doesn't always work, but a lot of times we're just seeing, we're like the golden age of board gaming, I think.
Oh, definitely. Oh, definitely. And particularly for Wargamers, I mean, as a historian, as soon as I fell into war games, I went and looked up the whole history of war games and everything that there is to know about it. And it seemed to me that war games in particular, they used to dominate the market.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Way back starting in the 50s and going all the way up even into close to the 90s.
Right.
The war games had dominated the board game industry.
Yeah.
I mean, there were a few other games, like Risk, which
Monopoly,
I'm not sure if Monopoly, exactly.
Yeah.
But really, war games started to take a giant slump when Eurogames became big, and people moved over to more lighter games as opposed to war games.
Absolutely.
And it's really been within the last, I would say, probably 5 to 7 years that war games have seen sort of a resurgence again.
Absolutely.
Particularly, one of the reasons that war games saw a slump is in their component quality.
Right, right.
A lot of cheap components.
Yep, and you compare that to a Euro, which a lot of times is very, very high quality pieces.
Correct. Yes, correct. And war games seem to really be making a good run for component quality these days.
Yeah.
And in some cases, I have some war games that I know for a fact are a better component quality than some of the Euro games that I played.
Sure, absolutely.
And yeah.
And one of the things that you'll hear us talk about quite often on the podcast is what the map looks like. As war games start to develop better maps.
Yes.
More better? Is that the right way to put it?
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
A more excellent quality maps.
And your love of the borders around all of the maps.
So Nate, a lot of times will chat me like, hey, I'm thinking about playing these board games. Which one should I play this weekend? And I just look at the map and be like, oh, this one has the coolest map, so you got to go for that one. But there's something to be said about a well-designed map. I mean, something that, of course, fits the theme of what you're trying to do as well. But it isn't just like, for the water. It isn't just blue ocean. Maybe there's some waves in there. Something to make it seem like you're more in that moment, giving you more of that experience.
I mean, a lot of things that I look at when I'm going to buy a war game, one is obviously the map.
Right.
I mean, I'm going to be staring at it for I don't know how many hours. So
too many hours.
I want it to at least be appealing. I want it to also really, hopefully, fit the theme.
Right.
And because I want to be immersed into the era that I'm playing.
Yeah.
So if I'm playing a World War II game, I want to feel like as if that I'm actually a World War II general, making decisions on the battlefield.
Absolutely.
As opposed to, well, it's just a blank map, and I'll just move these horrible looking pieces around, and have to imagine it all in my head. I don't necessarily want to imagine it all. I want to actually see it in front of me, and have that connection with what I'm doing. And so a lot of times I'll look at the map and then I'll look at the particular pieces that are in the game and what kind of how does the pieces look in terms of does it reinforce the theme again? Does it contribute to the theme? Does it add to the immersive quality of the theme, or are they distracting? And if sometimes the map may be gorgeous and the pieces are god-awful, and I'm not going to buy it because the pieces look terrible.
Right, absolutely.
I have had in some cases where I've bought a game and I loved it. The components weren't bad necessarily. They were just kind of bland. Yeah. And I actually went and made my own pieces for the game to try and spice it up a little bit.
Well, maybe that's something we should do an episode on at some point. How to make your own game pieces if you just really don't like what your games come with.
Well, it took many weeks. But anyway.
Yeah, well, at some point soon in this video, we'll have Nate pull out a few props to show everyone.
Oh, absolutely.
But I'll quick give some of my board game history. So, of course, I grew up playing the Ameritrash games. Actually, one of my first games ever was Monopoly Junior. I got that on my 5th birthday. And I played it so much that my family wouldn't play it with me anymore. So I would sit there, I turned it into a single-player game. And I would go around and I would take everyone's turn for them.
Interesting.
And then when I think it was my 8th or 9th birthday, I got this copy of Risk. So my first real game was a war game.
Interesting.
Now I told Nate I was going to ask him this question before I move on to the rest of my story. What do war gamers think about Risk?
No, it's not a war game. Okay. No, not even close.
No, why is that?
It's a Euro game with a war theme.
Okay.
If you can nuance it a little bit there.
Right, and I wouldn't even agree with the Eurogame side of things, because one of the kind of benchmarks of Eurogames is there's not a lot of head-to-head conflict.
Right.
I think it's just its own abyss, honestly. I think Wargamers and Eurogamers pretty much reject it, ultimately.
It's just there on an island of its own.
And I didn't do my sister who played this with me any favors, because I didn't really read the rules 100% correctly. So we just set up all of our armies, like every single piece available on the game. And I did read the rule right that you can just attack as much as you want in your turn. So I said I was going to go first, and I just attacked her for 2 straight hours. And she never played with me again. Now, I will say that Risk Legacy is a fantastic game.
Okay, I've never played that.
It's very objective-based, and you can play a game as short as 30 minutes.
Okay.
And the game builds upon itself. So
sure.
If you win, you'll get like a nuclear missile you can use in your next game. Only you can use.
Very cool.
And then once certain things happen, the game changes. So you can make a connection from Greenland over to Australia and that kind of attack. So it's once you introduce legacy elements to a game, I think you can take a bad game like Risk. And make it do something that's fun.
It's not a bad game. I've played Risk, and it's very fun to play. One of the reasons I wouldn't categorize it as a war game is that war games typically are, at least in theory, trying to simulate an actual historical conflict
sure.
or some type of conflict that has sort of a some type of background, whether it's like a sci-fi type of background or whatever, that it has some sort of context for that war.
Yeah.
But most of war games are historically based, historical conflict simulations,
Absolutely.
and Risk is just not that.
It's just one of those games that, like, if that was the only game in the world, sure, that's fine.
Sure.
But with so many other games, like, I mean, I'm never going to get rid of this copy because it's, like, my original one.
Oh, yeah.
And I'll play it with my kids. That'll be a good introduction for them. But it's never a game that I'm like, oh, man, I'm just in the mood to play Risk.
Right. I mean, one of the war games that I first started playing when I was a lot younger and really only saw it as the only war game until I saw my professors, my former professors, I should say, his collection is Axis and Allies.
Sure.
I mean, that's at least it's attempting to simulate World War II.
Absolutely.
I mean, it probably does it badly. It's like there's no approximation of each little infantry piece is an army corps or a division
but
or
still,
whatever.
It takes the idea of Risk and kicks it up a notch.
Correct. Yes.
Which at the time was very innovative.
Oh yeah, I mean, and Axis and Allies is hugely popular. I mean, now it's spawned not only just the regular Axis and Allies 1942 edition, but also now there's a 1941 edition.
Right.
There's a 1940 Europe edition and a 1940 Pacific edition that you can then put together and have this giant world conflict.
A grand time with it.
Oh yeah, there's 1914 Axis and Allies.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of different editions of Axis and Allies that have been spawned just from that one game from many years ago.
Yeah.
And I would consider that an actual war game.
Oh, 100%.
Because at least it's trying to simulate something.
Exactly, yeah.
So,
I think it's one of the definitions of war games. You have to be trying to simulate something. Even which we've talked about Star Wars Rebellion, which we both really like.
Right.
Even though it has a few Euro elements to it, I think we would both consider that more of a war game because it really is the head-to-head conflict trying to simulate something.
Sure.
The rebellion against the Empire.
Sure.
Ultimately.
Absolutely.
So.
And of course, you got to play Rebellion with some Star Wars music at the same time.
Of course, absolutely.
Get you really immersed into that.
Yeah. So to continue on my story, so in 2002, I got introduced to something a little bit different, though.
Oh boy, I know this.
Lord of the Rings trading cards. And this was my thing for years and years and years. 2001, 2009 or so, I believe. This is out of print now. This has been really replaced with Lord of the Rings, the card game. Different company, different mechanics completely. But that really kind of showed me there was something different than Ameritrash and all that. And then 2008, a friend got me for my birthday The Settlers of Catan. It's been rebranded now. It's just be called Catan, but this is my 2008 version. The Settlers of Catan. This is, everyone considers this the first Euro, made in 1995 by Klaus Tuber, I believe how you pronounce his name.
I believe so.
And he really popularized and really innovated the idea of Euros, which are really not a lot of head-to-head conflicts. You're playing on the same board, and you have ultimately the same objectives, but you're not trying to, attack someone, really.
Yeah.
It's just what can you do with the mechanic of that game, whether it's area control or worker placement or deck building or anything like that.
Yeah.
And one of the hallmarks, really, of a Euro game is that while there can be chance, usually the chance comes first, and then you figure out what to do with that chance. So like a war game is you choose your strategy, and then you roll, see what happens. Something like Settlers, you roll to see what resources you get, and then from there you figure out what you're going to do with that.
Right.
So this really changed my world completely. This is the copy that I brought to college with me.
I mean, it's an awesome game. I mean, I play it like all the time myself.
All the time. Every other weekend.
Maybe not that. No. I mean, I do know, I will say this, one of the teachers that I taught with in one of the schools that I taught in, that the other high school history teacher, him and his family loved Settlers so much that they had it permanently set up on their dining room table. And they played probably every night.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the game, the only Euro I played for years. So I actually got this midway through college and then just brought it on the dorm. And this copy rotated throughout all the dorm rooms. I was like, can we borrow Ryan Settlers? Sure, go for it. And I've got the Seafarers expansion, Cities and Knights. And there's a bunch more expansions now. I actually haven't played it in a long time just because there's so many other games I want to get to.
Oh, sure.
Ultimately. Actually, my daughter's getting Catan Jr. for her birthday next week.
Oh, very nice.
She doesn't know.
Very nice.
It's pirate themed, so other than your wheat and all that, you get cutlasses and molasses and booty and things like that. It's really interesting.
That's very cool.
And then around that time, I also learned Ticket to Ride, which isn't here as well. And I love trains. But the thing that really got me more into there's more than just Ticket to Ride and Settlers is this crazy game called Railways of the World.
Oh my!
And I'm gonna push these things down, and the box is literally falling apart. But this basically takes Settlers and Railways and throws them together. in a game that has almost no chance in it at all. The idea really is for this game is you have this huge map. I'm actually going to pull the map out real quick so you know how big it is. It's absolutely ginormous for a Euro game.
Holy cow.
So this is just the eastern half of the United States, and there's a western half that you can get as well. But effectively, you have all these cities, and you put what we call goods cubes on these cities. And the object of the game is to make tracks from one city to another and kind of take the goods and deliver them from city to city, and you score points based on how many cities you can pass through. You have to upgrade your trains to be able to pass through multiple cities. The cool thing is that there's absolutely no chance outside of how the board is set up, and you start out with no money at all.
Interesting.
You have to go into debt by taking out railway bonds.
Oh,
debt that you can
very
never pay
interesting.
off that plays against you the entire game.
Wow.
Really effectively in order to do anything. So the idea is how little can I take out, like to try to get ahead.
Wow.
Because if you take out too little, you're just gonna be behind the whole game.
Huh.
But if you take out too much, and if you're watching on YouTube rather than the podcast, you're seeing me
There
we go. Something like that. We'll fix that in a minute. But yeah, if you take out too much, then you're going to be hindered the entire game.
Yeah.
So that's the game that I still love. That one. That one is one that my dad and I play. Usually I keep that at my parents' house because he's a big train guy. He loves that. He loves that game.
Okay.
So I actually brought it back home specifically today just to show everyone. And then finally, I kind of played a bunch of games a bunch of years ago, and then I took a break, and then Dominion, which I know this is 10 years old now. It's actually more than that. It's like 13 years old. This is what really kind of showed me that there's other types of games out there, like deck building games.
Yeah.
And how Euro games can have kind of light themes. Like this is all fantasy, medieval themed, but at the same time, it's not really necessary to play. Ultimately, it's kind of there on top of the mechanic of deck building. It's the idea of you buy cards to buy more cards, to buy better cards, to buy victory points. Yeah. You just keep doing that over and over again. Yeah. But I put this out there as one of kind of my tentpole kind of games is because really from 2015 through 2019, I didn't play a lot of games. I had Settlers, I had Railways, and my parents had Ticket to Ride. A few friends had some games. Yeah. Played Android Netrunner, which is out of print, which is a fantastic game. But didn't really play a lot. And then 2019, right before the pandemic hit, we got Dominion. And we started playing that and loved it. And then when everyone was home during 2020 and it's a lot of 21, we just started playing board games. And now we have a backlog of games that we just can't get through. Things like Brass Birmingham, which I know you want to play.
Yep, I would love to try that.
Viticulture, Concordia.
Yeah, Concordia definitely. I mean Roman Empire stuff. That's my thing. That's right.
Yeah, so we'll get into more in another episode of kind of all the games that we haven't played and want to play and all that. But right now I have more games I know what to do with, which is a problem that most board gamers come across at some point. I know you are in that boat too.
Oh, definitely. I mean, in my office, the closet in my office is full of games. Yeah. And I've run out of space, but yet I still have more games on pre-order.
Oh,
so.
No, I actually haven't done a Kickstarter yet. I almost did last year. I just can't get into that world of like Kickstarting things. Because that's just a rabbit hole I don't want to fall down.
I did one Kickstarter. There's one company called One Small Step Publishing that redid a version of a war game that came out in 1980 called War and Peace. Yeah. It's a game about the entire Napoleonic Wars. And they had done a sort of a re-updated version of it all. Yeah. And it had been off and on upwards of, say, 4 or 5 different editions by the time it got to One Small Step. It used to be with Avalon Hill Publishing Company, which then eventually died off. Yeah. And it ended up at One Small Step, and they redid the map, they redid all the pieces and the player aid charts and everything like that, and then put it in a whole new package. And I had missed the first Kickstarter, and was super bummed about that until I saw they had launched another Kickstarter for another printing of it. Right. And like, I've got to jump on this. I got to jump on this. Absolutely. And what I didn't have any shipping notice or nothing. I wasn't told anything. All of a sudden, it showed up at my house, and it was a great day for it to show up because it showed up on my birthday. I was very excited. Very cool. Like, wow, happy birthday.
Happy birthday to you. I love that.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, with the roughly 5 minutes or so we have left for this episode, I guess, do you want to share a little bit more of like the vision for why we're doing this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, part of my goal for this is to try to expose a lot of Eurogamers out there to war games. That war games, in and of themselves, they may look intimidating just seeing them out on a table.
Right.
The rule book may be thick. There may be a lot of moving pieces in there, but it is actually not as complicated as you would think going into it. I know for you that you were pretty intimidated when you first started playing a war game with me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And was quite surprised of actually how quickly you could get into it. And then begin to actually not only just try to figure out the rules and the mechanics, but also then understand the strategy involved.
Absolutely. Well, especially when you start knowing the history. So we played War for America recently. We haven't actually finished it yet because it's such a long game.
Right.
But I'm a huge Revolutionary War buff. And yeah, I was very intimidated by the amount of rules and things like that. But then once you start getting into it, realize, I can kind of re-simulate what George Washington was doing. I'm going to go surround Boston like he did and see what happens.
Yep.
And it's fascinating because you get to relive a little bit of history.
Right, yeah. I mean, you have the opportunity in a lot of war games to make the same decisions that they did in the past, but you're not obligated to.
Right.
And sometimes you could even try to then see if I can do better than that person or that army or whatever.
Change the outcome.
Correct, change the outcome. I mean, for instance, one of the war games that I have on the Eastern Front of World War II, called the Dark Valley that I'll show at some point, that gives you the opportunity of, was it possible for the Germans to even be able to take Moscow in 1941? Or was it just inevitably they're going to lose at some point? And that game, you get to explore that. And you get to make those decisions for yourself. You're not going to have a Hitler out somewhere trying to tell you what to do. You get to make that decision yourself. So part of my goal is I want to be able to expose war games to more people, and to then also say that, hey, these may look complicated, but they're not. I know you will have a lot of fun if you just give it a try.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to kind of do something similar, but in reverse. Kind of show the wargame community that not all Euros are bad. Because in the wargame community, there is this kind of just this thing that Euros are just, they're not worthy in a way. Yeah. And I know that's not the case for every single wargamer out there, but you're one of them. You enjoy some Euros.
Yeah, it's not the case for me. I know in the wargame culture, a lot of people in the wargame community, you could more or less use the word scoff at Euros and what they are, and that they're not real strategy games. I've heard that comment before, that they're really not even a real game. Even some war-themed Euros that are looked at as a war game by more Euro people, that some of the war gamers say that's not a war game, and we won't consider that a war game. And I understand, I guess. I mean, if you've been playing war games for, say, 40, 50 years or whatever, then you already know that sort of genre that you're in, and you know what's not part of that genre. But for people who are just starting out and just getting into it, they don't have that exposure to those years and years of games. And they're not going to know necessarily how what a war game is and how a war game functions. They're just going to see a war-themed game and immediately assume that's a war game. So like one of the best definitions actually that I've heard about what a war game is a war game is really a game that you feel is a war game.
I like that. I like that a lot. So I mean, ultimately, it comes down to enjoy the games you want to enjoy, and we just want to expose Eurogamers to war games and war gamers to Euro games, because we're not seeing anyone else do that on YouTube or in the podcast arena. We see war games and we see Euro games, and they're separate, and we just want to kind of merge the two together. So that's really, as we wrap up this episode, what our vision is. So that's me and Nate's background in board games. And we'll be back next week with another video, another topic that we're super excited about.
Alrighty.